Have you checked the children? Your little master.
Hi, I'm Chucky. Wanna play?
Sometimes that is better.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
Long days and pleasant nights, fellow travelers along the path of the beam. I'm known on this level of the tower as Jaime and Fuego, and if you please, you join me here for a bit of palaver on Hail to Stephen King, not trying to destroy your eardrums as I always intend. People joke about that in the comments here on the horror show constantly, but bienvenidos and welcome. I'm so stoked to have you here for the weekly worship, at least for the time being, remaining on Saturday. And El Rey, as I've said countless times, is in fact my favorite author of all time. All those tomes you see behind me took about 7 years to go through all of them in its published order, and humbled and honored to have you here for a bit of further discussion, which was actually inspired. Once again, shout out to Maddie. He is a very active member in the Hail to Stephen King Facebook group that clued me into a number of scripts for aborted attempts at trying to bring The Stand to screen, both before the 94 miniseries that Mick Garris did that I love so very much, and afterwards, before we got the CBS All Access, soon to be Paramount Plus, I guess. I don't know. But so I've already done the first part of this, and that was looking at the script that basically dates all the way back to when George Romero at one point was attached to direct a adaptation of The Stand in the early 80s, and they're like, King tried to script something, put it together, didn't really work out so well, unfortunately. He just kept putting in these huge bloated, just oversized scripts, and they were like, can we do 2 movies? And then, no, we need to condense it down to 1 movie, which everybody who is a big fan of King's magnum opus knows it's a bad idea, man, but still tried as they might. And so I actually remember homie's name properly. So Pallenberg was the guy who did the script that was being intended to go to screen shortly before scrapped that entire theatrical project and did the Mick Garris one. If you want to hear all of the information about that pre-94 miniseries attempt, you can watch the previous video, part 1 of The Stand, the unproduced scripts. But this is part 2, guys. So basically in the early 2000s, I guess you call them the aughts, right? In the early aughts, they got the idea, the hankering, so to speak, that they wanted to do another version of The Stand. Around that same time, if I'm not mistaken, the Marvel comic series had just started, or at least shortly before that. And that is still, for my money, the quintessential, most accurate and awesome adaptation of King's source material that we have ever received. I'm so blessed to have the awesome omnibus of that. The artwork is tremendous. The writing is unbelievably faithful. They hit pretty much every major beat you can think of from the uncut edition, and absolutely love it. We're going to be finally doing a proper review of that sometime here in the future. But so, once again, there is a script, and I'm going to be just reading a couple bits of it, but once again, Maddie Jorson, you are the Shiznitto Bam dude. Thank you so very much for cluing me into this. I knew they were around, but I'd never really tried to properly seek them out. So, just to give a little bit of history before we jump into that particular bit. So, essentially, in January of 2011 was when this new version was initially announced. And you have to imagine that Warner Brothers Pictures and CBS Films was coordinating this effort very deliberately around the same time that the Marvel comic was starting to gain some buzz. The adaptation of The Dark Tower, which preceded The Stand adaptation at Marvel, had also done very, very well. And so they're like, well, let's strike while the iron is hot. Let's get this thing going. And so, yeah, that was when initially they announced that this was in development as a theatrical film. And lo and behold, they brought on David Yates and Steve Kloves. And those guys are most noted and most notable for their collaboration on all of those Potter movies. So I know Yates didn't come in until, oh boy, I don't think it was Goblet of Fire. I want to say it was Order of the Phoenix. And ironically enough, if I'm not mistaken, that's the only Potter film that Kloves did not script, because he did every single other one, both Deathly Hallows and, Half-Blood and Azkaban, and the 2 before that Chris Columbus did I didn't like very much, and he also scripted both of the Fantastic Beasts films. I believe he's doing the 3rd one, when and if that actually comes to fruition. So yeah, those guys were initially attached. They made the announcement in August of 2011, so later in that same year. And they were gone like 2 months later. They said, nope, it's a daunting task. We kind of think it needs to be a mini-series that will just serve the material more so than ever. However, we know that even with a 9-episode miniseries, it still doesn't always perfectly serve the material, but just they were bewildered by the condensing of so much important information. And yeah, so then in October of that same year, 2011, the reins were handed to none other than Ben Affleck. Yes, that's right, Buttfleck or Buttman or whatever. I've recently watched the Arrow edition of Mallrats and just had such a blast with that. So he was coming off hot at that particular point because he had just done The Town, I think like a year or so before, and he had also done Gone Baby Gone. So he was making that transition into esteemed and respected director in comparison with all of the, just goofy acting bits, forces of nature, and, obviously. I mean, Chasing Amy, I still think might be his best performance as an actor ever. It's such a tremendous film. Not to get all K-Smithy again, but so yeah, Ben Affleck is on board to direct, and then they bring on this guy, Dave Kajganich? I don't know. He had 2 major credits only to his resume at that particular point. He did The Invasion, which was the version of The Invasion of the Body Snatchers. I had Daniel Craig and Nicole Kidman. And then he had also done a film with Tom Skerritt, I believe it was, directed by Joel Schumacher. It was called Blood Creek. So not an extensive, background of produced stuff, but he was still brought on to do a theatrical version of The Stand. And so this is where it gets interesting because of the fact that, so he's brought on and he was originally told that it was going to be a 2-film kind of thing, similar to, Deathly Hallows and, so many other, so many different films now have broken the final entry into multiple parts. It's just kind of funny how that's become such a thing. And this was around the time when it was really starting to become just pretty prevalent and commonplace. And so he initially was told, yeah, we're going to have 2 parts. He submits the first part, and then they're like, nah, we're switching gears. We want just one really long film, push towards the 3-hour mark, and we're just going to do 1 movie instead of 2. They're thinking about the additional marketing campaign and all the expenditures of that, I would imagine. So Warner Brothers and CBS Films is like, that's what we're going to do. Then Affleck's like, peace, I'm not going to do this, and they bring in Scott Cooper instead. Now, Scott Cooper was another guy who only had 2 major credits to his name at that particular point. He had done something called, where the hell is it? For Sale by Owner. Never heard of it. He apparently had a smaller role in it. Maybe that's the one that had Tom Skerritt in it. In any event, yeah, he didn't really have much of a role in it at all. He was like a supporting player or whatever. But the big thing that Scott Cooper had to his name at that particular point was in 2009, he had made his directorial debut and also writing an adapted screenplay. It was based on a book, but none other than Crazy Heart. Yeah, he got a Independent Spirit Award for it, and also there was a lot of different, he didn't get any nominations at the Academy Awards. All of those went to Marissa Tomei and Mickey Rourke, obviously. Excuse me, not Mickey Rourke. Why am I saying that? I think I just flubbed both of those actors. But that was Jeff Bridges' movie, man. And also, funny how Fallen Feels Like Flying after a while. Tremendous song. Bridges ended up winning an Oscar. And so basically, Scott Cooper, he would go on to do Hostiles and a few other cool projects and stuff. But yeah, he was another up-and-comer. So you basically had between Kajganich and Scott Cooper in the last edition of this project before it was inevitably scrapped and Josh Boone came in and totally different thing at that particular point a year or so later. But yeah, these 2 relatively inexperienced guys, but with, I mean, Scott was coming in with the heat at that particular point. Not quite to the degree of Affleck's, obviously. But so, yeah, that is the script that I got to read. And so this is where I rarely jump on the phone here, but it's because of the fact that this is interesting in the way that, so this is the first polish, if I'm not mistaken, and it is dated September 16th of 2013, and first draft polish. So, but this is the first draft polish of him combining it into one, as opposed to, the part 1 of the 2-parter, because he never even wrote the second part. They just told him, as I said, to combine it. But it's interesting the way he goes about this because he's got some quotes at the very beginning that I found incredibly intriguing. He wanted to, and I'm assuming these would have been black screen and you see these quotes. So the quotes being, something from Tolkien in Lord of the Rings. It says, "The world is indeed full of peril, and in it there are many dark places. But still, there is much that is fair. And though in all lands love is now mingled with grief, it still grows, perhaps the greater." Very cathartic, and King would have most definitely approved because he has long said that the Lord of the Rings helped inspire this. Then you've got Abraham Lincoln, another interesting quote here. "Nearly all men can stand adversity, but if you want to test a man's character, give him power." Interesting as well. And then the one that it kind of goes without saying, and it's very brief and very poignant, and hey, Jim Morrison, "The West is the best. Get here, we'll do the rest." So I thought that was interesting. And then he has this little preface where he basically talks about how he is deliberately sequencing, as far as landmarks go, the journey of our peeps, our main Ka-Tet that is going across the country, our good guys who eventually all kind of join forces over the course of the way. And he wants to factor in all of these like big cathartic landmarks across the country and tie them all together, and then people can be like, oh, that was significant for this particular reason, and they made a stop there because of that particular reason. And he specifically has them go along the Lincoln Highway, which is a less, I guess, common and I guess prevalent, once again, way to go, from one end of the country, the east, across to another. It's more scenic. It has, it's got the red, white, and blue L across the entire way. And so this is my thoughts on a very different take of The Stand. Very different. And just bear with me here, guys. It is a 163-page script, and you guys know, typically it's about 1 page a minute. I could see this most definitely, with the fact that there is so much description of scenes. That is one thing I will say about Kajkanich's script. It is very cinematic in the fact that the previous script that I read and reviewed on this Unproduced series, it was dialogue heavy, and there was like minimal description of certain scenes and locales and stuff like that. Like, Kajkanich is very just descriptive, and I had a much better time, especially since we encounter a lot of different situations in this. I very much felt like I was there along the journey, much more so than in that previous script that I reviewed. So, interestingly enough, this opens with Flag, whereas he's like shrouded in secrecy in that previous Unproduced script that I read. The movie starts with Flag in this. He's in the Snoring Desert, he's like stomping around, and we are basically described right off the bat that he is all at once handsome and horrible, and I thought that was very intriguing. So, it opens up with him, as I said, and he's walking to Vegas. And he basically storms right into Vegas. Not storms, but he just like stomps right into Vegas, and he goes to the Luxor, of all places. And he goes and he sits down at a card table. Who's his dealer? Lloyd. That's right. Yeah, so not locked in a jail or prison or anything like that. He's not a nice guy, obviously, but as Flag starts kind of questioning him and kind of leading him into understanding what he's planning to do and the oncoming storm and all that different stuff, Lloyd like just quickly retorts at him, and he's like, "Yo, man, I'm clean, and I've got my dealer's license. I'm trying to go straight and be like a better person and all this other stuff." So it's just interesting, the recruitment process and how that all goes down. And when Lloyd deals him cards, like, Flag flips him over, and first they're blank, and then you see eyes, and obviously, Flag has his eyes all over the place, or they could be Crimson King eyes, if for those who are really, really tower junkies or whatever. But so then we jump to Stu Redmond, and it's interesting how he is described as having the energy of a loner and being old-time tough. I thought that just really got me into the mindset. And another thing I will credit about this script is, compared to the previous Unproduced one that I read, the dialogue is much snappier, it's much better, it's much more in-depth. I felt like the conversations were much more natural, and just the flow of the dialogue seemed more like real people talking. It was more intuitive and interesting and sharp and stuff like that. So yeah, he's basically getting out of the Arnett Bar Mill, and he goes and he talks with Vic Palfrey, and he's like, "Hey man, you going over for that beer?" And he's like, "Yeah, damn right." And so they meet up, and obviously this is where we get the Campion crash and everything. He leaves in an ambulance this time, and of course he still dies. And then it immediately, so whereas the previous Unproduced script moves pretty briskly, this one, for whatever reason, even though it's like a similar page count, I feel like since the dialogue was better, it just didn't feel as like jumpy and jonky. And so we do jump right after, the gas station crash oh boy, I'm trying to remember the name of homie, but it's totally inconsequential. But then you jump to Colonel Starkey, and Starkey actually arrives at the Irwin Army base where this virus escaped. He's dodging reporters initially, but then right after he gets out of their sight, he puts the gas mask on as he's actually arriving. And they just very quickly, as the military, come to a realization that, wow, this shit got all the way to Texas. We have to implement Shroud Protocol, which you can probably imagine means like just destroying entire communities and, quarantining and all kinds of different stuff like that. But you don't really see a lot of the nefarious military in this, as far as like, trying to silence broadcast voices and things of that nature. But the fact that we do see things from the military perspective is still pretty cool. So then we basically jump right into Stu's first dream. Stu dreams of the Rockies, and he basically just very briefly hears Mother Abigail's voice, and then he awakens and he calls Hap. Yeah, that's right. Hap was the gas station, like the little drinking hole. And he gets this call from Hap that wakes him up, and apparently him and all the buddies and, kids of the buddies and stuff, like they're in the hospital. Things are getting really bad really quickly, and it hits really close to home because Stu goes and he can't find his dog, and his dog is like, there's foam at the mouth and spit up blood, and his dog is dead. So, and of course, immediately he's like showering and scrubbing himself like crazy. And then he goes down to the gas station and he just sees the full extent of it. And then we immediately jump to Flag and Lloyd once again. And they're having this weird picnic in Vegas. They're like in this storm drain, and there's even tourists walking by and gawking at them and like taking pictures and stuff like that. But yeah, this is basically where Flag isn't like, he basically proves to Lloyd really quickly that he can, like, he knows some dreams he's had. And so he's like proving his power and his insight and intuitive nature and whatnot to him. And he says, yeah, I was walking through Idaho. That's like the first thing I remember. I don't know, maybe my last life I was a carpenter, which I think is very funny. And I know that's, it's in other versions of this, but it just cracks me up every single time. And so he basically says that he's trying to work up his magic, and he's trying to call his chosen few together. And Lloyd uneasily agrees to, kind of go along with him. And then this is where it becomes very apparent that this is Stu's movie. So whereas, the previous films, the newest adaptation, the previous adaptation, 94, and even the previous unproduced script that I read, comic book obviously, and the book, it's an ensemble. This is very much like Stu is our lead. And we see the onset of the apocalypse, the destruction of the world, basically, in America specifically. We see it mainly through Stu's eyes until he starts to meet up with everybody else. So we have him in the hospital gown, and then he's taken to the CDC by Derringer, voluntarily, heads out there to Stovington and everything. And then one thing that I'm trying to remember his name once again, Kajganich. It's such an interesting and unique name. I have to keep going back just to remember it properly. He has a lot of montages in this. So, and he even describes them within the script as like this first one. This is the end montage, And the This is the End montage is basically the spreading of the virus. And so it's just a montage and a bunch of different clips of, since this takes place during the holidays, ironically enough, and it's very specifically mentioned by the military guys like Starkey, they're like, man, everybody's traveling, they're going to spread this shit like wildfire sort of thing. That's just me paraphrasing. But yeah, it shows people on flights, people in bars, people at arena football games, people at holiday parties, and you're just like, man, we're screwed, And yeah, and then Flag's eyes watching throughout all of this, which, comes up quite a few times. But then we briefly meet Larry Underwood, and this is like, as I said, Stu is our lead. We get a tiny taste of Larry early on. He's on this flight, he wakes up hungover, pops some pills, there's this girl sitting next to him on a laptop, and Larry in this iteration, in this turn of the wheel, he's on American Idol, and she's like, oh, I thought that was you. I'm rooting for the little girl, but you're still really talented. You'll have a career past this. And he goes and he bangs her in the bathroom, Mile High Club status, and he's not a very nice guy. He's like, yeah, bitch, you like that sort of thing. And you're just like, oh, Larry, my God. I mean, it really nails down the fact that he is kind of a slime ball. And, you know, depending on the iteration, they've either cranked that up, they've amped it, or they've kind of downplayed it. They really do it here, but then there's a plane that almost crashes into Larry's plane, and then when they narrowly avoid it, that plane goes and crashes near the Rocky Mountains as they're driving, as they're flying over them, and you're like, holy shit, man. So Larry lands, and he just brushes the girl off, and she gets all pissed at him and says, I hope the girl wipes the floor with you, or whatever. And then we don't see Larry for quite a while, because as I said, this is Stu's thing. It basically turns into almost like an I Am Legend sort of situation here, because aside from like a little bit with Flag where he's at like this basketball court and he's like moving basketballs around and floating and trying to like test up, and it's almost like trying to strengthen a muscle. He's like trying to just you know, really get his powers even stronger and stronger. Aside from that, and Starkey, you know, realizing the full extent of everything, and just seeing all the dead bodies at the military base where this where Captain Trips escaped and stuff, and then you see the dead woman scientist, and she's like, it works. Any questions? She's got the thing over her body. But so aside from those two scenes, the rest is nothing but Larry, and we're talking nothing but Larry for like over a dozen pages of script, you know, which could be anywhere from the 12 to 15 minute range. It's just all Larry's story, very similar to like an I Am Legend sort of thing, because he escapes from the CDC, and it is very faithful, I think, to the source material and also to the great adaptation in the Marvel comic, because he's like he has the weird, like, he thinks he's hearing voices of corpses like, come have some chicken with me, and all that different shizzle. So yes, he makes his escape, and it's very cinematically described by our screenwriter here. And yeah, man, it's just all Stu for so long, it feels like, you know. And then it goes into, after he escapes the CDC, then it goes into this Long Island montage. So it's basically, there is a lot of big action set pieces in this script, which I have to make mention of. This, especially in the third act, my God, we'll get to it. But so there's this whole bit where, you know, Larry is like trying to, excuse me, I keep saying Larry because Larry's the one trying to escape, you know, New York, and yet it becomes Stu in this version of the script. And so he goes from Stovington all the way down, and he's trying to get through New York City. He's trying to get across the Brooklyn Bridge, and there's this insanely large action set piece where there is like this big boat that is just slowly going towards the bridge as he's trying to get across it, you know, get from the east to the west tower or whatever. And yeah, it smashes into the Brooklyn Bridge. So this is the kind of big action set piece, big, you know, disaster spectacle. They would have had to spend some money to make this movie, man. They seriously would have. And so that's interesting in that regard, obviously. But yeah, so that transpires, and there's this whole Long Island montage of him trying to get through. Then as we get to the hike up through Manhattan montage, there's this cross-dressing monster shouter and trying to steal cigarettes off corpses. He ends up running a folly of these two twins and then a few older people who see him with this gun, and they try to mug him. One thing here I will say is they lean really heavily on Stu Redman's military prowess and experience in this, and it really comes into play in the final act. But yeah, it's interesting in that regard, but you kind of know what's happening. Weirdly enough, they do say that it's been 6 months since the actual onset of the outbreak, and so a lot of time has passed, rotting corpses, all that different stuff, so it basically just makes a significant time jump at that rate. And so he escapes these muggers, and then he makes his way towards the Lincoln Tunnel, and of course you're like, oh, okay, so it's going to be him going through. However, they do throw me a curveball in the fact that when he actually goes through, he meets Larry. Larry has apparently, like, he went and hid in a cop car. There was like kind of a window that was a little bit down, and he somehow squeezed his way in there with a bunch of dope. And then he's like, oh, I couldn't get the doors open, so I couldn't get out. And so he's freaking out about that. And that's when, stark raving mad, Larry is found by Stu. Stu, like, pulls him out, and we do get a brief Rita Blackmore mention in the fact that just passingly, Larry says, yeah, you know, there was this girl who's with me, but she couldn't take it. She only got about halfway through, and, you know, she, you know, used razors and cut her wrist and killed herself. So there is just a brief passing mention of that. And then the two of them basically team up, and they're like, yo, let's get on some hogs, and, you know, let's go down this Lincoln Highway, because that's what the dreams have been telling, I guess, both of them pretty much, but more so Stu. And things get really, really wild as we get into the second and third act. But Flag is tempting Stu a couple different times as well. He basically shows him in this dream what Vegas could be for him and how he would be revered and naked women coming for him, all this different stuff and the glitz and the bright lights and everything. But we do eventually jump back to Vegas, and we basically have Flag and his second-in-command, Lloyd, clearing out the tower of, the Luxor. Because remember, there's the pyramid at the Luxor, if y'all have ever been. I'm here in the deadly desert of Arizona, so I've stayed at the Luxor quite a few times. Probably my favorite Vegas hotel. It's not too nice, too pricey, but, still in that regard, it's, it's still pretty dope. I love the whole, just Egyptian aspect of it and whatnot. I think it's pretty rad status. So they're clearing out the tower, though, as opposed to the pyramid specifically, which they eventually get to, and that's where, Flag just basically is telling Lloyd that he wants to recruit Stu, and, all that different stuff. So, they have their dueling dream discussion, being Stu and Larry, as I mentioned already, and they're like, we have to make our route to the Rockies, and, and that's where we get our first mention of Trash Can Man, very briefly, in Pennsylvania, and Norman encounters this woman who knew that he burnt the, pension checks or the disability checks or whatever the hell it was, and that, her son knew him, and she just knows how horrible of a person, Norman is. And so that's interesting. And he goes and he blows up her SUV that she's about to try to escape Pennsylvania with this black kid who came down from Chicago. And that's pretty much all we get of Trashy for quite a while, because then we jump back to the Lincoln Highway, and this is another montage, the Lincoln Highway, Pennsylvania montage. And these montages are obviously time savers to just move the pace along, and because there's so much dialogue and internal stuff going on when these characters are sojourning, whether separately or once they start to meet up with each other. This saves time, and in trying to condense all of this text into a reasonable runtime, even if it is going to push 3 hours, you gotta employ tactics like this. And so yes, landmarks galore before our duo of Stu and Larry finally meet up with some other people, and they meet Glenn, Nadine, Joe, and Kojak all at the same time. They're all hanging together, and that's when Glenn Bateman proceeds to be like, heaven or Vegas? And of course they're like, yeah, we're going to Boulder, and he's like, I was hoping you were gonna say that, and they basically head out themselves. And this is when we finally get our first little reference to Harold's messages that he's leaving, his painted messages of where they're heading and all that other stuff. And we finally meet Harold and Franny, but just like another introduction we're about to get in a few pages of the script with Tom and Nick, it's really brief. It's basically Harold's like, let's get married, Franny, and she's like 7 months pregnant in this, so that's like, much further along and very evident and obvious right off the bat. And she's like, no, Harold, I don't want to marry you. She's listed as being 22 and him 17, and there is reference to Harold's sister and how he used to be teased and whatever. But then that's all we get, aside from the fact that we know there's motorcycles coming, and we're just like, oh, that's got to be, Stu and Larry and the gang. Or is it? So that's when we jump back over, and, our team is camping out. Stu's crew, as I started calling them as I was making my notes here, they camp out, and during dinner, or after dinner I believe it is, they start having this discussion that is prompted by Glenn Bateman about the fact that maybe there is this sort of psychic connection, along with the dreams and everything, potential power that could be wielded. And so, Nadine maybe has a tiny little bit of it, but Stu it becomes very apparent that he does have the shine, the touch, whatever you want to call it, because they do this little almost like psychic Pictionary sort of thing where they're like, draw a picture and then let's sit and then think really hard about it and see if any of us can pick up on it. So this is where we start to see that it starts to sow the seeds that, okay, maybe it's not going to be Nick Andros in this who has that sort of ability. It's going to be Stu instead, which is what it pretty much comes out to be. Nick and Tom, they're meeting, which is right after that. Once again, very brief, and then it's right back to the Stu crew, where he is starting to have these waking nightmares at this particular point, especially as they're approaching Lake Michigan. He envisions like the dead corpses coming up out of the water and stuff, which is pretty wild. He also envisions Flag transforming from a crow into a man, but wearing this silly kind of crow mask. I think that that's kind of lame. But yeah, and they meet Trashy in this. Trashy is camped out like right beside them. He comes over and asks for some food, which they proceed to give to him. And then Larry's like, I'm suspicious of that guy. And Larry goes and follows him to all of those tankers in Indiana that, remember, he goes and he blows up, man. And so this is where Stu's powers start to become really this is where this is the first where it starts to kind of get off the rails a little bit, because after Trashy blows stuff up and all the shrapnel is like kind of raining down and stuff, this is where we start to really realize and comprehend the extent of the power that Stu wields, because he basically makes this silver kind of shield around their tent and protects them. Yeah, it basically, he becomes a superhero. Yep, there's your popsicle stick joke, everybody. And yeah, so then we basically find out who actually rode those hogs up to Franny and Harold, and it was none other than Garvey, and I want to say it was either Vin or Vicky and Vic, whatever. I don't know. Basically, Garvey is the leader of this gang of guys who, as if you remember, with Dana Jurgens and those women, had been kidnapped and were being drugged and held hostage and stuff. You see a similar scenario in the 2020 version of it. But it is described in this crazy shootout that goes down, between the Stu crew and Garvey and his gang. It's very violent, and it is very just epically described. I described it here as a thrilling shootout with the Stu crew and the women kidnappers, but it leaves Larry near death. He has a shot go right through his lung. And this is where suddenly they all start, like around the same time, they all suddenly started calling Randall by the name of Flag. They just all of a sudden start calling him Flag, that I thought was kind of interesting. But so, yeah. Larry is mortally wounded, and this is where you start to really, you're like, wow, this is going to be really different, because Stu goes and Stu heals his mortal bullet wound. I still don't know what I thought about it. Hey, it's different enough, but it's veering into superhero territory, far beyond anything King ever envisioned, but hey, it's at least doing its own thing. Shortly thereafter, Flag-controlled horses come and drag Stu away to the surviving members of the Garvey gang. They proceed to drug him, and they're trying to take him to Vegas. Then we have this crazy pursuit with Larry and Glenn and a surprisingly capable Harold. He's much more ballsy in this than in other incarnations. And yeah, they go after it, and there's another big action set piece, this time like a chase shootout sort of thing on the highway, where we've got motorcycles, and then we've got trucks and cop cars and rocket launchers and grenades. The shit is nuts, man. It is legit high octane, and you would have needed a very capable action director to put together a lot of these insane scenes. And yes, Stu is, as you would imagine, inevitably rescued amidst all the carnage. And this all happens in the midst of a Flag-generated tornado going down. And I know you guys who are familiar with the source material will know about that. But yeah, they, being Glenn and Harold and Stu and Larry, they finally find sanctuary in a cellar with none other than Tom and Nick and a couple corpses down there too. So in turn, those guys, they like, our Ka-Tet is growing. They go and they join, Franny and, and the ladies and stuff. Nadine, obviously, Nadine and Joe. And so now we have this big group. And after that, we finally meet Mother Abigail. She's barely in this script. It's really kind of sad, but once again, when you're trying to speed things along so goddamn much, it just is what it is in that regard. We don't meet her in person till page 104. Aside from those couple dreams, I think there's maybe 2-3 dreams total, and Stu's the only one that we actually see in the script having the dreams. Other characters mention it, but that's it. So we finally meet her, and she proceeds to tell Stu that she sent Campion to him. He was chosen. I thought that was a little like, the fuck? But yeah, so that's what happens. And then Garvey's men catch up trying to track down Stu after finally, meeting up with Mother A and the peeps that she was with. And she goes over all messianic status. And that is definitely what they end up doing with Stu. Stu becomes like the proverbial messiah of this story, seriously. But Mother A goes and she sends them away. They're like blinded for 3 days. They'll walk for 3 days and then remember who they are, so on and so forth. But yeah, and then Harold suddenly, and the thing is, since things happen so suddenly, like the weird horse drag away stuff and a few other bits here and there, Harold, we don't see like the building brooding at all. He just, for whatever reason, suddenly is controlled by Flag, lines a bunch of the grenades from the artillery they stole from Trashy's camp, and he blows up the area where Mother A and, a bunch of the other peeps are visiting, but she's able to use her, force field, same power that Stu has, contain it. It mortally wounds her, but she saves everybody else. That's pretty much everybody else. Nick doesn't die here, so that's something to keep in mind. And yeah, she tells him what to do and tells him that he has to go and lead a war. And you're like, lead a war? Are we really going to go to that level in this? And they speed things up too. They send Tom and Nadine as spies in this. Nadine is good in this, guys. It's nuts. She basically becomes the Dana Jurgens character in a lot of ways. And yeah, Harold slinks away around this same time because, you know, the blow up and stuff, even if he didn't get the full extent of the carnage he was hoping for, or Flag was obviously hoping for. And Flag is getting frustrated. He's frustrated back in Vegas about the fact that his tornado didn't do its job. He is like losing the approval of people, and Lloyd senses that, just like in various iterations of the story, that he's losing some of his power because of this. But he shrugs it off and he's like, nope, Stu is going to come to me and I'm going to take Stu's power. Stu has already taken Mother Abigail's power, so it's like a transference to make yourself even more powerful, almost like a Rogue or like maybe Jean Grey, I think, sort of situation. In that regard, Rogue is probably more just more important, or more just subjective here. But Harold becomes the trashy in this because he meets up with none other than the kid. You know, Happy Crappy, and, you know, I'd piss cores if I could. You know, I'm Louisiana. Anyway, he doesn't get violated with a gun by the kid, but he is forced to bang a mannequin with holes in it when they stop off, and he's very boldly saying he's gonna take down Flag once they get to Vegas. And so Tom and Nadine, they get there, and they get to Vegas as the proverbial spies. And Flag apparently has cleared out the whole Luxor, and he's got like 500 something people there. So obviously, as far as the scale of soldiers and like people on each side, this is significantly less than in pretty much any other incarnation of this that I've read. And he apparently greets every new person who shows up, and he shakes their hand and steals some of their silver, their power. And that's what happens here. When Nadine is right about to walk up and shake his hand, she basically does the Dana Jurgen, and she pulls out her little box cutter or whatever the hell it is thing. She slices his neck, he stops her, and then he basically crushes her head, and like blood comes out of her eyes and her mouth and everything. And then he's like, we're gonna make an example of her, go, you know, hang her from what does he call them, scaffolds in front of the Luxor. And guess who gets to join her on the scaffolds upon arrival in Vegas? None other than the kid. Harold is led and basically treated just like trashy upon arrival, as Lloyd's like, yeah, we have a suite all ready for you and everything. And then Happy Crappy himself, the kid, he's basically put up on that scaffold himself, and he's not quite dead when he's just like, you bugger, and all that stuff. So it's kind of a funny little cut, but this is where the movie, or the script for this film, goes batshit crazy off the walls in every possible capacity, because we essentially, Stu, he addresses all the Boulderites, as they call them, presumably performs a miracle to get them all on his side, and as opposed to sending just a small group, he basically mobilizes 450 people in this big coordinated Battle of Las Vegas, as they end up calling it. And it's really cool to drive from Boulder to Vegas, because being here in Arizona, and they drive through Arizona, and they're talking about, you know, Williams, and, you know, going through just all these different places, and talking about, you know, Boulder City, and just all these landmarks that I personally know very well. It's intriguing just I'm like, oh, I know that place, I know that place, I know that place. And it becomes a big coordinated like war of insanity. And, you know, there's a convoy to Zion montage, because this whole group of like 450 people from Boulder, and they all break off into different groups, and, you know, like Larry's leading a group and Stu's leading a group, or maybe Stu is going solo, I'm trying to remember specifically, but because he's basically going to confront Flag himself, and Glenn has a unit, and you know, Nick has a unit, and Franny goes along. She's in like the back, in the rear of the army, because this is a fucking army that's going against. It's so much different than anything, and the battle has so many different facets to it. There's sharpshooters, there's blowing up of, you know, just these eagle eye places where, you know, guards on the perimeter of just the Vegas zone. Trashy is there, and he blows up the Hoover Dam, and all the water goes down into Vegas, and like Stu looks up at the water as it's coming towards him, and he envisions it as being blood, and then just there's these insane shootouts, and, you know, Nick gets a bunch of his hand blown off, and, you know, there's howitzers, and there's I mean, there's so much crazy carnage, It is mind-blowing. Once again, you would have had to have a prime action director. I can see why they went for Affleck initially, man. You know, and even Yates, because there's a lot of action in those Potter movies, but not with guns and stuff. And this is very artillery heavy, very R-rated in its violence and the craziness that goes down. But it really boils down to this final confrontation in Vegas between Stu and Randall. Flag knows he's coming, and Flag actually, with all the people fleeing Vegas from, you know, the Hoover Dam being blown up by Trashy and killing Larry in that particular fashion, they have no more power, or so we think. And so Flag is just basically, it's like two gunslingers walking to have their final showdown in the OK Corral sort of shit, but this time in New Vegas. The script amusingly calls the fleeing Vegas people that Flag is apparently okay with. He tells Lloyd, he's like, yeah, just make sure they go hide in the mountains and, you know, that they're protected. And you're just like, the fuck, really? That he's cool with this? All right, that's fine. But they call them the Lost Vegans. It's obviously poking fun at a particular contingent that I do not want to make fun of, but I just thought it was an interesting little bit in the script. But when these two finally meet each other on the streets of Vegas, and there's mention of, you know, oh, the Stratosphere is up there, and New York is over there, and the Excalibur has a show, and the show at the Excalibur, that, like, the artwork and the statues, it's basically the cover of the original novel, and there's the two warriors going at each other. It's pretty dope, but it doesn't feel like The Stand. It feels somewhere between, like, I don't know, Chronicle or like a Dragon Ball Z fight or some crazy shit. It's definitely superhero stuff because they're like hurling projectiles and stuff. Flag is ripping off pieces of the casinos and hurling it at Stu, and Stu's like deflecting, and he's like putting up silver force fields, and Flag is even like these pieces of debris are tearing up people who are trying to escape Vegas. Like this movie would have cost so much goddamn money to make. It's insane. It really, really genuinely is. Yeah, the iconic, I'm just going off memory at this particular point because it's so nuts. But yeah, the iconic hotels, the final confrontation, telepathic projectiles, insanity, all this other stuff. And then Flag, he like shoots his power outside of Vegas at Franny, and so she starts going into labor and having the kid, and Flag's like trying to kill the kid, but Stu is like trying to use his power to step in and stop it from happening, and Flag is convinced that he can coerce or at least beat Stu in battle and steal his power and all this other stuff. That doesn't end up happening. Good prevails, Stu wins, and he thinks of taking Flag's power right at the last minute as he's defeating him, and he's just like, no, I'm not going to. So the powers leave, and then this shell of a man that Flag's, the essence of Randall Flag, you know, Walter, Walking Dude, you know, whatever, Richard Ferris, whatever the hell you want to call him, it departs this shell, and yeah, he's defeated, and that's it. And yeah, Stu makes his way back. Franny has had her kid, although ironically enough, there was somebody beside Franny when she was having that kid, and it was none other than Harold. He was holding her hand as she had it, just like he promised earlier in the script he would. And then when she looks for him after having it, he's disappeared. It's kind of crazy in that regard. And then Glenn Bateman, who survives, you know, we fast forward, and Tom Cullen, who actually, basically Stu is mortally wounded after the fight with Flag in Vegas after that 101 mano a mano shit. And basically Tom comes up and shakes Stu's hand and gives him some of his silver, some of his essence, and that's what saves Stu. And everybody goes back to Boulder, and you've got over 1,000 people there, and Glenn Bateman's like, hey, we should throw a party. But the fact that this was a full-scale, like, war almost between the two sides, it's obviously so much its own thing. I'm sure some would hate on it. I didn't even know what to think as I was reading this shit, because it was the utter antithesis of Standing, you know, and this was more delivering than that. So, and yeah, basically, yeah, Battle of Las Vegas was bonkers in this. This whole thing just went batshit crazy off the rails in the third act with the scale of the final battle. Nothing like anything I'd seen or read before for something that calls itself The Stand. So there you go, guys. At the very end, it's the holidays once again. The holidays bookend this. The script starts with the holidays, ends with the holidays. Everyone's smiling. Kojak shows up, and they're just like, okay, there we go. Roll the credits. But then there's a post-credits. Ha! You probably guessed that would be the case. And in this case, there is, because we fast forward to Harold down in Mexico, stomping around, and he finds some new boots. His shoes are like just torn to tatters from walking so far after leaving Franny's side after she has her baby. And he immediately starts talking in Spanish to all of these marauders down there, and he's like, "Who's in charge?" And he smiles. And you immediately know, you're like, oh, that's the new body for the Essence of Flag, man. So that, I am breathless, because holy shizzle did... I gotta give, once again, Dave Kajganich some credit for just having the balls to do something so drastically different. And I'm sure, you know, Owen and Josh Boone and the guys behind the 2021 version pat themselves on the back saying, yeah, we told it out of order and that made our story really different. Not really, man. If you want to read something that is just batshit crazy and calls itself The Stand, this is your version, everybody. Never got made, and so yeah, I am breathless. I've lost my voice after that crazy discussion, everybody. Probably close to an hour. I can't even quite read how far I've gone along. But a grande gracias once more to Maddie from the Hail to Stephen King Facebook group for cluing me into this. The third and final installment is going to cover Josh Boone's, I believe it's 2014, when he came on to this attempted reimagining of The Stand and did a completely different script all his own, although I think it was the first in what was supposed to be 4 movies he was hoping to make. I appreciate the ambition. I know they were trying to do it as a Showtime series at one point, whatever. We will get to that in the third installment, but once again, thank you so very much, everybody who has tuned into this. I have been Jaime and Fuego. You can find more on all social media sectors like Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, here on the YouTubies, where I do have a personal channel called Infuegotainment. It's about to do kind of a big relaunch here on March 1st as far as like getting back into content and, you know, just, I don't know, I took a brief little siesta, but there's all kinds of awesome older videos of the non-spooktacular variety there. Obviously, a like, a share, a subscribe here is much appreciated. The support is rad status. Y'all are awesome. And yeah, if you want to have that further palaver, the Hail to Stephen King Facebook group, it only has about 1,000 people that are members, but we have great terrific palaver amongst everybody there. And lastly, there is a book of the month that is always done, and none other than Dreamcatcher, which I've talked a lot of smack about over the years. I have revisited that this month. Different set of eyes, so I'm looking forward to discussing that on the first Saturday of March. And also, you can look forward here in just a couple days to a brand new review of Stephen King's Later that comes out this upcoming Tuesday, March 2nd. So if you haven't pre-ordered it yet, you know, try to find a store where you can actually go pick up a physical copy. I will be putting up a review of it this Tuesday. So you're getting twice the Hail to Stephen King this upcoming week. But yeah, that's going to be it today, guys. So until the Wheel of Ka comes around once more, hasta luego, sin amigos, constant readers and viewers alike, say thank you. I hope we share more of this palaver sooner rather than later. And until then, remember to stay scared and read Stephen King. That's right, if you haven't read The Stand, I mean, obviously that is the creme de la creme of this story, but god damn was this just nuts.